Welcome everyone to this talk on Wilhelm von Humboldt's educational ideal. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, leave a comment down there in the comment section. Also feel free to support me on Patreon. Thank you very much. Now, Wilhelm von Humboldt was born in Potsdam in 1767 and he died in Berlin-Tegel in 1835. Wilhelm von Humboldt counts as one of the most, if not the most important educational reformer in German history. He experienced the stormy days of the Enlightenment firsthand, and his response, his mediation of the challenges and new freedoms was his educational ideal. He founded the Berlin University, which today is named after him and his brother. Wilhelm and his brother Alexander von Humboldt, who traveled the world and was a true polymath, are two of the most influential German thinkers of the past 250 years. This talk will focus on Wilhelm's suggestions for the ideal university. Bildung. Before we can in any meaningful way engage with Humboldt's ideas and ideals, we need to clarify a German concept that is difficult, perhaps even impossible to translate, and that is the concept of Bildung. Bildung is commonly translated as education, but could also be translated as formation, development, learning, and culture. Alas, none of them quite grasp the meaning and depth of the term. It is, however, fundamental to gain an understanding of this concept, since it is fundamental to Humboldt's thought. If we reduced Bildung to education, especially in the contemporary sense, we might understand Bildung merely as something that we get, something that we need in order to function in society, something that we pay for to become a well-functioning wheel in a well-tuned wheelwork. We go to university to get a degree. We pay for it like we pay for any other service. We pay for education, hence we do expect something in return, at least to break even, but we do expect a surplus, a financial surplus. We are guaranteed a student experience, whatever that means, and the rankings machine ensures that all results are accounted for and evaluated continuously. The degree is worth little in and for itself. It is to be understood as a credential on the job market. And you hear this from leftists as well as from right-wingers in academia. One increases one's potential, one's prestige by attending a university and study program, which is a very interesting term if you come to think of it, that scores as high as possible in the rankings. The game of the hour is early specialization. This is true for engineers as it is true for philosophers. We have to specialize ourselves. We cannot become eclectic, erudites, thinkers who have a profound understanding of history. We are supposed to be engineers in the humanities. Bildung in the full sense of the word, and in the sense of Humboldt, has little, let's say nothing, to do with education in its contemporary sense. The word Bildung is also related to Bild, meaning, image, Gestalt, form, and even ideal. Thus, in Bildung, there speaks the strive towards a higher ideal, even to the highest ideal, that is, to the idea of God, which of course for us after Nietzsche is easy to ridicule and maybe nearly impossible to comprehend. This strive for Humboldt is internal and must be based on the free choice of the individual in order for the individual to actualize his highest, innermost potential. There are, of course, also some external constraints and conditions at work in Bildung, and there must be a set of optimal conditions for high Bildung to be achieved, yet the primary focus is on the individual and his free choice. Education, on the other hand, comes from the Latin verb educere, meaning to bring out, to lead out, to pull out. there's a distinct and purely external sense that speaks in education. Whoever gets an education gets something pulled out of them. The motivation, the drive, the demand are external. One gets an education, just like one gets a bottle of beer at the supermarket, according to the demands of the market and or the state. Perhaps there's not much difference between the two. The purpose of an education is primarily external, not internal, if there is any truth to that etymology. In German, it would be impossible to say, I want to get a Bildung, whereas the English vernacular can very easily, and all too easily actually say, I want an education, I'm going to get me an education, I'm going to get me a degree. As there are different educations. Bildung is inherently universal, whereas education already speaks of particular interests and specializations. The German vernacular can only say sich bilden. Ich möchte mich bilden. I want to form myself. I want to literally form myself towards an ideal. Bildung, therefore, is fundamentally self-referential and self-reflective, but in light of a higher ideal. Of course, this does not mean that the German education or university system is perfect or anywhere near the Humboldt ideal. Perhaps the opposite is true in Germany as well, because we've introduced mass universities in the 1960s, and the recent so-called Bologna process that to this date depicts one of the most fundamental technocratic processes of Gleichschaltung in the university and academia is probably detrimental to Humboldt's ideal. Bildung as self-activity. In Ideas for an Attempt to Determine the Limits of State of Effectiveness, is a long title, by Humboldt, he constructs his argument on the individual and her telos, her final cause, which is self-activity. The telos of the individual is self-activity. That's what it strives towards. The text was written in 1792, but only published posthumously in 1851. Scholarly opinion is divided as to whether the text was actually censored or whether it was withheld by Humboldt himself for fear of being censored. John Stuart Mill begins his book on liberty with a quote from Humboldt on the state's task to foster, quote, human development in its richest diversity. Even though Humboldt's text is as utopian, perhaps, on the prospect of human freedom as is Marx's vision of communism, his essay still contains crucial insights for us today. Often suppressed by libertarians and communists alike when referring to Humboldt is his distaste for happiness and welfare, if they are valued above greatness. Whoever determines happiness and welfare as more important makes himself suspicious, and I quote from Humboldt, that he misunderstands humanity and wants to turn humans into machines. So that's something maybe for Bentham to consider. The state's task is, however, precisely not to interfere directly with the well-being of its citizens. The state is only to provide the negative freedom necessary to make such diversity possible. The rise of materialism and the emerging bureaucratic state are tremendously terrifying prospects for Humboldt, and he wishes to purvey a theory of man, of the human being, and state where the human is not reduced to a machine. In his essay, Humboldt argues that, quote, the true purpose of the human being, which unchangingly prescribes her, is the highest and most proportionate Bildung, self-formation of his or her forces towards a unified whole. Another quote from Humboldt, the more the human being is active for himself, the more he will form himself, sich bilden. These two quotes contain two of Humboldt's central ideas. First, the concept of proportionate formation of forces or strengths, and second, the concept of self-activity, both of which are interlinked. Bildung then is self-realization, self-cultivation or self-culture, as the American transcendentalists translated the term Bildung, self-culture. So you see, it actually, when you come to think of it, it doesn't even require a definite place. It simply is self-activity, self-cultivation, realizing one's own potential. You don't need the university for that necessarily. Humboldt's cosmology is Aristotelian, broadly construed. His idea of force or energy is informed by Aristotle's dynamis energeia relation. The forces, the diverse talents one is given, must be actualized in a self-referential act of actualization. The formation of one's forces must be, or strengths or talents, must be proportionate in the sense that the individual avoids over-specialization, but instead brings into harmony all of his or her talents and remains open to diversities of thought and opinion, subjects, texts, and fields of profound interest. One's strengths are in conflict with each other, Humboldt argues. The goal must be to engage all of them, to bring them in a harmonious but also tension-filled play. You see, again, Humboldt is a classical thinker in that regard. One is to avoid one-sidedness at all costs, because one-sidedness would mean imbalance and disharmony, and ultimately one-dimensionality of life and a stifling of human creativity. The ultimate purpose of education, of Bildung, which is always primarily an act of the self aiming to cultivate itself, is the purpose of the universe itself for Humboldt. Humboldt's Bildungs Ideal, his educational ideal, is thus inseparable from his broader cosmology. The goal of individual self-cultivation is not narcissistic or egotistical, but is to become members, citizens of the world, to become proper cosmopolitans, a free society of free individuals conjoined by their respective self-acts. With education of the individual as the purpose of the universe, Humboldt's ideal aims at no less but at fulfilling the end of the universe. Humboldt lists two conditions necessary and sufficient for the achievement of highest proportionality: negative freedom and manifoldness of situations. That's a quote from Humboldt. Since, quote, even the freest and most independent human being, if placed in monotony, will develop to a lesser degree, end of quote. Humboldt is aware that concentrating on many things at the same time might cause the self to be scattered. Yet, this is precisely not what his concept of proportionate formation of strengths and diversity of interests aims to allow for. It's not about being multitasking and doing too many things all at once. The goal is not scatteredness, which today we call euphemistically multitasking, but totality, wholeness, harmony out of the inner imbalances and drives that strive towards different directions. But how can totality of the individual come about? Proportionate formation of strengths is not focused on objects or on tasks even. That means not on various external demands, but rather proportionate formation is focused on achieving dynamic harmony within oneself, entirely independent of objects. This leads us to Humboldt's second central idea, to self-activity. Proportionate harmony can only be achieved with and by an internal self-referential act. A self-referential act that is, however, secondarily also concerned with society. Self-activity is necessary because, quote from Humboldt, whatever the human being does not choose himself, wherever he is only slightly constrained and governed, such will not pass over into his soul or essence, such will remain foreign to him, and he will not authentically carry it out with human strength, but with mechanical proficiency. The innermost choice of one's pursuit is what brings into harmony one's drives and one's talents and strengths. In the self-referential act, the individual recognizes her potential to become a unified self of highest proportion. The potential is realized not for external and contingent goals, but for the sake of one's inner harmony. It should be mentioned that Humboldt by no means limits self-activity to intellectual pursuits. He explicitly allows for any other activity, including trades and crafts. Quote, any kind of employment or pursuit are capable of ennobling a man, to give him a determinate, dignified gestalt. The only thing that matters is the way it is done. So Bildung is precisely not confined to the university or to the intellect, to the mind, but it also can be found and can be actualized in trades and crafts. Humboldt's ideal society would come about if and only if the individual is free to choose a diverse building for him or herself in a self-relational act. But the place, though, still, for proper higher building would be, for Humboldt, the university, in the way that he envisions it. In 1809, Humboldt wrote 2 texts for internal use of school planning, after he was appointed Director of Cultural Affairs and Education with the Prussian Interior Ministry. The 2 texts, entitled Königsberger Schulplan and Litauischer Schulplan, mark Humboldt's most fundamental contribution to new humanism and are the cornerstone for the foundation of the institution of the Humanistisches Gymnasium in Germany, grammar school, a school that is in decline in Germany at the moment. Because it doesn't yield any immediate use to learn ancient Greek, unfortunately. But of course, we're all European. We don't learn Greek and Latin, but we're all European. As Michael Foster has shown, Wilhelm von Humboldt begins to develop his concept of proper university education already in the 1790s. And already then, at this early stage, his focus is clearly on the free act of self-cultivation based in language. Humboldt's ideal originates from within the broader aspirations and goals of secularization put forward by the Enlightenment. Universities were to be free from concerns and demands of religion and faith, but also free from the demands of the state. At the time that Humboldt wrote, a pressing question was which, if any, influence the state or the church should have on higher education. Humboldt found a companion in thought in Friedrich Schleiermacher, who supported the view that universities should teach students how knowledge itself is discovered rather than merely pass on the dogmas and doctrines of the schools. There wouldn't be PowerPoint presentations at such a university. The role of the university, according to Schleiermacher, was thus to provide a space for self-development and self-cultivation, self-culture, that makes possible the acquisition of the sciences in an independent and proactive manner. Similar to Fichte, Schleiermacher's proposal understands the university as a place primarily for the study of philosophy. Unlike Fichte, however, who wanted the university to be absolutely free from any constraints, Schleiermacher recognizes that the, quote, the drive for knowledge of the university must be brought into some semblance of harmony with practical civic needs and historic institutions and learning. This was a quote from Richard Crowther's book on Schleiermacher. Humboldt's ideal is based on a similar conception. The university is to be a place of independent study, while formally ensuring the needs of the public good are met. Humboldt's ideal university is formally open to all classes, even though he was personally aware that not all classes could afford study material and living costs. The ideal of assuming that everyone is basically capable of studying at university is certainly also at the heart of the problem of mass-marketized universities today. Humboldt's university is the Universitas Literarum, though, devoted to the letters, but not a mercantile enterprise. It's devoted to language. It's devoted to language, not to mathematics. In a crucial passage in Litauischer Schulplan, Humboldt argues, the insight into pure Wissenschaft, science, which only the human being can find within himself. And it could be, I should just add, maybe that Wissenschaft here he means metaphysics. Anyways, this is reserved for him, he says, to the university. The quote continues, in order for this self-actus to take place in a most authentic sense, both freedom and helpful loneliness are necessary. And from these two aspects, the entire formal organization of universities arises. Taking seminars is a minor matter. What is essential, however, is the community of like-minded peers and the consciousness that at the same place there is a significant amount of already fully educated and formed, vollendet Gebildete, who do nothing but dedicate themselves to the enhancement and propagation of science, of Wissenschaft. End of quote from Wilhelm von Humboldt. The university is the place for Wissenschaft, for philosophy, for the letters, for the ancient languages, who grant us access to the truth of the cosmos. Those who speak of cosmopolitanism today may want to turn to what the cosmos meant to the Greeks. You cannot simply use such a word. It's meaningless, and actually more than meaningless, it's not just devoid of meaning. It crowds out meaning if you just say something without basing it on anything or where it comes from. Now, the formal organization of the university is to be oriented along two aspects: negative freedom and loneliness. The student must be free from constraints such as the demands of the market and the economy, or even the state. Loneliness speaks to the necessity of that negative freedom. Students are left alone from bureaucratic mechanics of academe. They are not at the university to learn the dogmas and pieties of the age, but to challenge learned opinion and create their own methods for engaging with the sciences. The self-actus, the self-referential act of the individual that decides to dedicate himself to Bildung, is only possible within such a structure, Humboldt is convinced. But this would not be at all the university we have today. You would not be able to get a degree in engineering at such a university. You would only literally study philosophy, theology, the ancient languages, law, perhaps, medicine, maybe, perhaps physics to a certain degree, as some would argue at the same time. But that's it. There wouldn't be degrees in media studies or business. There wouldn't be rankings which lead you to the best university to get the most money afterwards. It's not an investment, right? The student remains a human being first and foremost, and the student is not reduced to her status as a student, which in our day has become a parameter for the continuous unquestioned evaluation of evaluation. The student's time at university is not reduced to some measurable, arbitrary, nationalized, globalized, homogenized student experience, but it is a time space granted for self-fulfillment, to become who one is. That's what the university is. That's why the university is called university, because it fulfills the purpose of the universe. It's not called university just randomly. That there's a meaning, there's a reason for that. Right? Humboldt's ideal is that without external pressure and demand, the individual will find within herself or himself the greatest urge to fulfill herself or himself, to bring all of their talents into harmony. Another most important aspect is free association amongst peers. There is no competition. This includes, we would say today, the possibility for students to discuss their diverse and conflicting opinions, which will train them to test the pieties of their age. So thank you very much for listening. Feel free to leave a comment. Feel free to support me on Patreon. Feel free to reach out to me, by the way, if you'd like to speak to me on matters which I call philosophical consultation. I provide philosophical guidance. I also teach privately. I have students who I read Plato with, and Heidegger, and Aristotle, and other thinkers, of course, as well. There's also a video that I will link to in this video, which is another lecture which is quite similar to this one, on Humboldt, on cum dignitate otium. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and till next time.